right, ladies and gentlemen, so we're at the final kind of time period of the semester. We're actually only like 2 or 3 weeks away from ending our year. So that's kind of exciting and kind of sad. But anyway, so we're looking at the 20th and 21st centuries. This is really the modernist and postmodernism movements. So some key events that happened in these centuries, in this time period. World War I, of course, was 1914 to 1918, the first Great War. Great Depression strikes, 1929. World War II occurred, 1939, 1945. And so the Great Wars really changed the landscape of the entire world. Not just, we think about how America was impacted, but England was impacted vastly as well. In fact, World War II, chances are England would not have been the same had America not come and joined in. And then we had the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, which was a big deal with the European countries. In 2016, the United Kingdom left the European Union. So those are some key circumstances that occurred in this time period that really kind of went to what the literature really was about and stood for in that time. So a few things that occurred, the Education Act of 1870 made it to where everybody went to school. And so suddenly we have this very mass amount of literate people living in England for the first time. It wasn't only certain socioeconomic groups, it wasn't certain genders. A lot of the population, the majority of the population rather, was literate and could read and could correspond with these texts in ways that they hadn't been able to before. And we also see a rapid pace of social and technological change that hasn't gone away. Even today, we still see the social and technological changes going on. You can really see those, especially right now in the time that we're currently in. There was a mass dislocation of populations. We had a lot of exiles and we had a lot of moving around. This was due to the wars. This is due to the empire itself, and it was due to economics of the world in terms of where people could actually make a living, where people could survive. We saw a mixing, because of this dislocation of populations, there was this mixing of cultures and classes in this rapidly expanding cities, which again, we still see today. The ethical and social codes were disturbed because of this mixture. And so the assumptions about self and community in the world suddenly are cast in doubt because not everybody believes the same way or believes in the same things. And so we have this kind of mixing pot happening where all these doubts come into play and these alternate thoughts come into action. In 1990, we see Sigmund Freud coming out, and suddenly psychoanalysis is this big deal, and we're suddenly thinking about the inner workings of the brain and what's going on in the human psyche in ways that hadn't been explored previously. We also see this, the women's suffrage movement going on, where women are demanding rights. And in England in 1918, women over the age of 30, they got rights. They were suddenly equal-ish. And then in 1928, all women were. So we see a changing dynamic in the country. So some major concepts of the time period. We have two real big movements here, and that's the modernism movement and also the postmodernism movement. And both of these are very key. And both of those we will see in our literature during this unit. So modernism, some key elements is individualism. The individual is more interesting than society is. The characters in the stories, they tend to just try to keep their heads above the water. The world and society equaled a challenge to the integrity of these characters. We were talking about real people, and we're still looking at the common man, but we're looking at a suffering common man that is just trying to get through the day, day by day. We also see some experimentation. The old styles and the old forms are kind of thrown out the window. and it's kind of a free-for-all in terms of poets and writers alike, and how they were going to compose their texts. You see this big movement for this stream of consciousness writing, where it literally is just writing exactly as you're thinking. It's kind of almost similar to journal writing. You're just writing what you think, and it tends to resemble a pattern of human thought. If you look at Faulkner and you look at a couple of those other individuals, you're going to see this really be a big influence in their writing. You also see wars. Many of the writers in this time, particularly poets, they were either soldiers in the wars or they were nurses in the wars, and they had firsthand experience. And so you see a lot of this war mentality going into it, and the problems with war and the sufferings of war. And so we see this kind of concept that this world is a crazy place. It just doesn't make sense anymore. Symbolism was big in this time period. Nothing is as it seems. Everything and everyone has a deeper meaning. Everyone and everything is symbolizing something else. And so it's really difficult to kind of get everything that's meant to get out of the text. And this is really talking about critiquing the story. I don't know that writers sat down and said, okay, well, I'm going to put Joe in there, and Joe is going to symbolize this, and then I'm going to put Anne in there, and Anne is going to symbolize this other thing. But it's what we as readers took out of it, and that still continues today too. Postmodernism really kind of began around the 1950s. We know that there were huge changes in the 1950s. You had this explosion of communism around the world. You have this explosion of equality. Even in America, that's when we had, the Harlem Renaissance, and we had our Martin Luther King Jr., and we had these people who were standing up and trying to end this centuries-long inequality that was going on with the people that surrounded us, really. And so during this time in England, we see all these power shifts in world dynamics. There's a dehumanization in post-war era. Consumer capitalism takes a key role. And these writers, they give voice to the insecurities, disorientation, and the fragmentation of the 20th century and the world beyond. In postmodernism theory, everything has already been said and done. There's no such thing as a writing that is 100% original. And so when we write, we draw inspiration from those texts that have already been written. This kind of theory and critiquing text really is studying how each text is somehow connected to another. Intertextuality, these are two relationships that we have when we read. The first relationship is between the reader and the author, where the reader is really kind of connecting with the author and the words that are in the text itself. And then the second relationship is between the reader and the other books that they've read. And so they equate this reading with what they've already heard and what they've already seen and what they've already experienced through these other texts. And so we get this sense that no text whatsoever can exist in isolation from others. So I hope this little short kind of blip kind of helps you out a lot in terms of looking at the modernism and postmodernism theories. And then we can read the text for this unit, most of which are poems, and most of them deal in some way, shape, or form with the wars that really ravaged through Europe during this time. If you have any questions, please reach out to me, stop by, email, ask me in class, whichever works best for you. But please don't hesitate to ask. All right, y'all have a great rest of your day.